psychology professor and giving a TED Talk was not even close to my #1 career choice. Probably should have mentioned it before you all bought tickets, but I hope when you see the top list here, you'll forgive me. Wielding a laser pointer is a bit of a letdown. But if you can get past the overpowering nerdiness of this, what I think is interesting about a lot of these characters is that we tell stories about success. All of them have very strong success stories, assumptions about why people are successful. Is it an innate talent? Is it practice? Is it drive and motivation? Is it luck or social class? What contributes to success? Psychology has really interesting answers and research on all of these. And what I'd like to talk about with you today is tests, IQ tests. We're most commonly exposed to these. They wind up impacting our lives in various ways. I don't think anyone really enjoys taking them. But do these things matter? Do the characteristics that they assess matter? So that's what I'd like to talk with you about today. Is this part of the story of success in the real world? So let's start with what we're all most familiar with, using standardized tests and admissions. And there's a very common claim that tests don't really measure much that's very important. They only predict first-year grades. Well, we got kind of obsessive about testing this question. We pulled together data from over 3,000 studies and over 600,000 individuals, and we looked at every major graduate admissions test there is. So from medicine to law, from PhD to MBA. We collected data on how these tests that are used to make decisions about admissions are related to subsequent success. I don't get out much. So this is what we found. We found that everywhere we looked, there was a positive relationship between test scores and subsequent success. And not just for grades, but for other things, like faculty judgments of a student's professional competence and promise. That was predicted by test scores and fairly well. Success on licensing exams, even the amount of research and how highly cited that research was predicted by test scores. Now, none of these relationships are perfect. People are complex and messy and very hard to predict. You might find that frustrating. I call it job security. But in most cases, tests are one of the, if not the strongest predictor of subsequent success. Now, this is what it would look like if tests only predicted first-year grades. I know the difference is subtle, but this is fact, and this is fiction. Okay, so tests predict learning, and in this case, some very interesting demonstrations of learning, applications of learning. Doing research is an application of learning for a graduate student. Tests predict those things, but do they really only just kind of measure book smarts? That's a common thing that people say. So do tests really just measure book smarts, or are they related to real-world things like creativity or success in a job or how people advance through their careers? Well, we looked at this with the Miller Analogies test, and I'll tell you why we did this. The Miller Analogies test is one of the most book-smarty tests you could get. The story goes that Miller and his wife would walk along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, and they would play a game together. And the game went like this. One of them would come up with the first half of an analogy based on things like art, or science, or history. And then the other one would have to come up with the second half of the analogy, guessing at the relationship the first one came up with. It's beautiful nerd love, really, if you think about it. So you cannot get more of a book smart test, but Miller was no fool. The test was used heavily in admissions for graduate students, but he cross-marketed it under a different name to make hiring decisions for complex jobs like managers and engineers. So we pulled together data on over 20,000 people in both academic and work settings to see if this book smarts test, this basically assessment of the liberal arts education, predicted. And we found, sure enough, that it was related to educational outcomes, as you might expect based on what I showed you earlier for other standardized tests. But it also predicted how well people performed on the job and their career potential, and even evaluations of their creative accomplishments. This is actually not a surprise at all to the field of industrial and organizational psychology, which has been studying people in work settings for decades. There have been over 21,000 samples collected on standardized tests, paper and pencil tests, predicting subsequent job performance. And the overwhelming conclusion is that these things measure something that's related to job performance. There's so much data on over 5 million people that some people in my field say, let's just stop studying this because it's boring. We know the answer to this. Let's move on. I think actually the pattern of findings is kind of interesting. On the top is the relationship between test scores and performance, depending on the complexity of the job. And for high complexity jobs, we find that tests are in fact better predictors than for low complexity jobs. There's more knowledge to acquire and more information to process. We see, just like in the educational setting, that it's related to training programs, both in military and occupational settings. Tests are related to acquiring job-relevant knowledge and skill. But it's also related to creative work accomplishments and leadership performance, objective leadership performance, where the performance of the leader is related to the overall performance of the work group. These work groups perform better if leaders have higher test scores. Now, I'm going to take those last two and break them down a bit, because you may be wondering, how can a test that has one right answer be related to creativity? How can this possibly be the case? Well, creativity is not just generating lots of ideas. Creativity is also seeing how these ideas are interconnected with each other. And even more importantly, it's seeing how these ideas are interconnected with each other and knowing which of them suck. So, knowing that the ideas and things you put together and filtering them and finding the best one that you're able to generate is an important facet of creativity. In the case of leadership, research on leadership theory has suggested that there are basically two major dimensions for leadership effectiveness. And the first one is called consideration, which is related to a leader's personality. It's acting with integrity towards your subordinates, treating them with a fair amount of respect and kindness, taking into account their differences. The other half of it is initiating structure. And this is coming up with goals. We're going to go this way and do this, or we're going to not do this thing instead. And also organizing work, structuring the work so that it gets done efficiently. People with higher test scores are much better at knowing which is what direction to go and how to organize the work most efficiently. And as it's already been alluded to, based on research and theory in leadership, Captain Janeway is unambiguously the best captain. Captain Kirk was great, and I can't wait to see the internet comments, but Janeway was better. So tests predict seeing patterns and making better decisions on average. And again, the relationships aren't perfect and other things play in. We had that whole list at the beginning. But tests are an important feature of these things. But now you might wonder, well, don't they just only matter up to a certain extent? They matter up to a mid-level, and then after that maybe it just levels off. Is there a point beyond which test scores don't matter? And no. These are 4 large-scale samples where they looked at the relationship between test scores and performance in both academic and work settings. There is no leveling off. In fact, the lines accelerate. The relationship gets stronger at the extremes. It does not level off at the extremes. This is easily the most dramatic demonstration of the lack of a ceiling on the importance of test scores. This team out of Vanderbilt University did an astonishing study. They collected information about 13-year-olds who scored in the top 1% on standardized tests. So these are people at the age of 13 who are getting phenomenal SAT scores. They're kind of annoying, I understand, but they then followed them for 25 years to look at their career accomplishments. They found that SAT scores were predictive of patenting technology, publishing research in science, engineering, and technology, publishing novels and collections of poetry. But that's not even what's cool about this study. What's cool about this study is they took this group that's in the top 1% and they broke it into 4 groups. The bottom 25% of the top 1% up to the top 25% of the top 1%. So on the left, we have students who are just over the 99th percentile. They're at the bottom 25% of the top 1%. We'll call them the dumbasses. On the left-hand side are the students who are the top 25% of the top 1%, and we'll call them the smarty pantses. As you can see, the smarty pantses are far more likely to have these extraordinary career accomplishments, even though those who are at the bottom 25% of the top 1% are an extraordinarily accomplished group. They're earning doctorates, publishing novels, doing research at a much higher rate than the general population. And yet, there is no ceiling on the importance of these scores. The higher scoring students do far, far more in their careers 25 plus years later. So there's no ceiling on the importance of test scores. But is this really just coming down to social class? The study I just showed you, they did control for the effects of the quality or caliber of the school that the student went to, and they found that that didn't make the relationships disappear. But are tests really just fundamentally capturing social class? Well, the two are certainly correlated with each other. There is a relationship between social class and test scores, but it's not anywhere near as strong as I would imagine most of you think of it. And also, it doesn't explain why tests predict, by and large. So we got obsessive again, and we collected data from a variety of sources. A new data set of 41 colleges and universities across the US, longitudinal data sets in the United States, even information about law schools. The top bar shows the relationship between the test and subsequent grades in school. The bar immediately underneath it for each and every sample is taking out the effects of social class. There's not a big difference between the two. Social class does not explain why these tests are predicting subsequent success. In another study, we were concerned that given this correlation between test scores and SES, is it in fact the case that colleges and universities are filtering out massive numbers of low SES students? Is this basically a barrier for students to get in? So in a sample of 110 colleges and universities sampled across the United States, we looked at the diversity of the students who applied, who submitted their test scores, and those who actually wound up enrolling in college. And we found that the reduction in social class and diversity of SES between those who applied and those who were admitted was very small, about 3% reduction in terms of diversity, and some of that was actually at the high end in some cases. In contrast, for test scores in high school GPA, the reduction is about 20% in terms of the variability of these scores. And schools are indeed paying attention to these when making decisions about who to admit. They want those, all else equal, with higher grades and higher test scores. But the test isn't acting like a barrier for people to get into college. So here's a pop quiz. Let's take extraordinarily well-prepared students coming out of high school. Top 10% of ACT or SAT scores with an A- or better GPA. So these are students who on average would do very well at pretty much any college or university. What percent of them come from the bottom of the income distribution? Well, it's actually none of these. It's my talk, It's actually 17%. If you thought any of those other numbers was reasonable or plausible, you have to unlearn what you've learned about the relationship between social class and test scores. Now, the 17% is actually important, and we can map out potential human capital in the United States by thinking about this. This is 35,000 students every year who have these credentials who are from the bottom 25% of the income distribution. But here's the problem. They do not even typically apply to high caliber schools. They are not typically going into schools that have excellent graduation rates, where people are going to get pushed as hard as they can on leading edge stuff. We're missing out on this huge pool of talent, and hopefully interventions will be developed to reduce it. Because we need them. We need their science, we need their technology, we need their art, we need their TED Talks. We need these people because intelligence is part of this story. Thank you.